Hello, everyone. Today we will talk about what is a critical national infrastructure or critical infrastructure. I will be using these terms interchangeably, and you would also notice in the literature that different countries are using various terms, but most common is the critical infrastructure CI. So what we will see in this presentation is that what is a critical infrastructure, how they are identified, and why these days we hear a lot about critical infrastructure, but why there is a great focus towards it. So let's start off by understanding that what is a critical infrastructure and what it is, its significance. So many countries have their own definitions to define critical infrastructure. Um, and as I have mentioned that out of those countries, I have taken one of the examples here is of US. So in the United States, there is this USA Patriot Act in which the definition of critical infrastructure is stated. And I will read it that systems and assets, whether physical or virtual, so vital to the United States that the incapacity or destruction of such systems and assets would have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, and or combination of those matters. So this is more of a technical definition, but to understand in a nutshell that any asset that may result a detrimental impact to a country, an impact on a national level, anything that may cause an impact on a national level would be a critical infrastructure. Right now, it's just a definition and on a very high level. So as we move forward, we will better be able to understand that how critical infrastructure impacts a country. So that relationship we will see as we move forward. But before that, we would want to understand that, what does really national level impact mean? So as I have read the definition for you earlier, you would notice that there are key aspects which constitute the national impact. Number one is economy. Another we saw was public health and safety, and another one was national security. So these are the major aspects that any impact on economy, any impact on public health or safety, or any impact on national security will constitute that it's a huge impact, an impact that may result a country to basically disrupt, or a country would go in a mode where they would not want to go in. So any asset that is either enabling, contributing, or supporting any function that contributes in economy, public health, safety, national security would be a critical national infrastructure. This whole story will glue together as we move forward. Now, let's talk about how they're identified. So, before we go towards a common approach that there is within different countries, you have to first understand that there is no best way to identify the critical national infrastructure. You cannot just really say that this particular method is good and this isn't. There have been many papers written which are publicly available, which demonstrated, or you can say, shows that how various approach are good and bad, and how this particular approach is better than that one. So there is no best way. However, that we will talk about a common approach that we have seen across various countries. So moving on, this is the common approach that you could notice that first and foremost, there is this, a lead, a CNI lead. From CNI lead is that there's this authority which is established by the government who leads the overall CNI program within the country. And how do they operate is that they operate with, sector leads. Now, who are sector leads? Sector leads are usually such departments or authorities which belong to a particular business sector. It could be, for example, energy sector, or it could be oil and gas sector, health sector, whatever that may be. Um, but certain sector leads are appointed by the government from each sector to work with the CNI lead to identify the critical infrastructure. And why is it? It's because the sector leads basically understand their sector more than the CNI lead. Because CNI lead is rather, overseeing the whole program, but this sector-based approach that, each sector has its own critical infrastructure that would be contributing to the country. So the sector lead would know better that which infrastructure would that be within their sector. So first and foremost, what we have seen is that both of these authorities, CNID and sector lead, are basically given the power, the authority by law to basically perform such activities. So all the entities within the country are by law liable to basically follow when it comes to the overall CNI identification. Then the next step is that basically then there is an identification of critical services, functions of each sector. For example, uh, there is this Ministry of Oil and Gas. Then this Ministry of Oil and Gas is a sector lead, and one of their critical service would be the production of oil. Okay. Similarly, if Ministry of Energy, the a critical service would be generation of power. Similarly, all the sectors have their own critical functions or services which they identify, and that's the first thing that they identify. And the thing that comes afterwards is then they identify the thresholds. For example, how would they, like, based on they would want to define a criteria based on which they would identify organizations, and then make an organization to identify those critical assets that would basically are enabling, supporting, or contributing on their critical function. We will see a very good example in the next slide, but for now, to understand that critical functions are identified by the sector leads, okay, because they know their sector better, so they are better able to identify those critical functions. And they identify thresholds. For example, in power generation, they define this criteria. Okay, any any power generation plant which is producing more than 10 gigawatt of energy is very critical because our national grid is this much. So this 10 gigawatt is a huge input or part of the overall national grid. So we would want this organization to be treated as critical. Then let's go and tell this organization, hey, tell us all the assets which are basically enabling, supporting, or contributing and generating those 10 gigawatts. And when those assets are, jot down, they are then reported to the sector leads. The sector leads then have their own review. There is this process of filtration or validation. Then they go communicate it to the CNI lead, who is responsible to create the overall national risk register for CNI. And similarly, things move forward, then it is reported to the president. So I just explained this whole cycle and that how the overall sequence of action take place for the identification of CNI. Note that there are certain cross-sector dependencies. For example, you would be wondering that for a nuclear power plant to start, it needs a source of electricity to basically start off and then perform its function, which is of course again is the electricity generation. But there is this dependency we see, right? So without electricity prior would you know would basically not allow the nuclear power plant to start at first place. So there is this dependency. So these dependencies are also identified and quite deeply looked into, and it's a very complex problem and a subject to discuss with. But this is part of the overall picture that which is looked after while the overall CNI program is carried out. So let's look at an example. So as I had mentioned earlier, so how would you identify a critical infrastructure and basically power sector? So basically, this what sector lead would do is sector lead would first define a criteria. Okay, they would define a criteria that any power generation plant which is generating energy more than 10 gigawatts is critical. Okay, period. So what they do is basically they identify all such power generation plants or companies who own these plants, which in terms are also called CNI owners. So uh, these companies or plans are then identified and then they're communicated by the sector lead. Hey guys, any asset, any asset, which is either enabling or supporting or contributing in the generation of total 10 gigawatt which you generate, is need to be identified and then report it to us. So what organizations do is basically then they go, they perform their homework, then they identify all those assets which they usually have, if they have good risk management practices, and then they report it to the sector lead. And what does that sector lead do is basically they consolidate it, perform a validation, perform a review, filtration, and of course, then the sector lead communicates it to the CNI lead as I had communicated to you earlier. So if I go a bit deeper, so even an PLC or even any operational technology asset, which is basically, you know, performing its operation to basically make the turbine run, is critical, would be critical. And to that level, they are going to go and identify those assets. Um, Now, there's another discussion that, what does critical national infrastructure then constitute? Would that be uh, a building? Would that be something? So generally, it has been noticed that uh, the first aspect is the human aspect. The part of critical infrastructure would be that you want to see that is there any human impact when a particular infrastructure is disrupted. Then an aspect is of the infrastructure itself. For example, uh, if I just stick with this example, the PLC, which is or through which the turbine is being operated, the building within which this operational technology is hosted will also be critical and would need a certain set of protection in order to secure the overall critical infrastructure. So this is the overall, I would say, on a high level explanation that how a critical national infrastructure is identified and how it is looked up to. So moving on, that why nowadays we see that there is a huge focus on CI/CNI. So three major reasons. Number one, that as we have discussed earlier, the CNI or CI has a national level impact, and there has been a huge surge as well, like the recent Colonial Pipeline attack in the east coast of the US. Then we had another Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp attack that happened in 2002, and then Florida water plant incident that happened in 2022 as well. So these are the recent surge of such attacks, which basically compromise the country in a way that affects either economy, national security, or the public health and or safety. And why is this happening is because, of course, one of the third major reason is that the global political situation is basically triggering state-sponsored attackers to basically perform or carry out attacks on certain infrastructure or assets which really does impact a country. You would not want, a country, a rival country would not want to basically cause harm to a country by attacking a particular organization. Maybe if uh, that particular organization has a national level impact, but normally they would target critical infrastructure and try to carry out attack on those. And these are the state-sponsored attackers, which all of the public research organizations like Dark Reading, IDC, and Kaspersky, who publish reports, annual reports, you would notice that there is a huge rise of state-sponsored attackers, and there's a huge rise of such attackers attacking or targeting the critical infrastructure. So I guess these are the three very high-level reasons why nowadays we see a great focus towards this subject. So here we would conclude. I would request you that if you have any clarifications or recommendations, please feel free to comment in this video, or you can always email me on contact aliqureshi@gmail.com. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope that on a high level you were given a good overview about the CI or CNI. Thank you very much.